Okay, good afternoon. Well, while this week is dominated by the visit of Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard, there is one announcement I'd like to make. Cabinet today agreed that the financial assistance for legal costs will be provided for the Pike River mine workers who will have a crucial role to play in the Royal Commission of Inquiry. You will recall that Cabinet has already agreed on the provision of legal assistance to the families of those who died at the Pike River mine. Today's announcement is over and above that. While there were 150 workers and contractors engaged by Pike River at the time of the initial explosion, it is still to be determined how many of these will be required by the Commission and therefore offered legal assistance. It's difficult to estimate the total cost of legal assistance to employees and contractors who are required to appear before the Commission, although it will be clearer once the Royal Commission has finalised its work programme. This week I'll return to Auckland in anticipation of the arrival of Prime Minister Julia Gillard tomorrow. I'll attend a breakfast with Global Women in Leadership before greeting Prime Minister Gillard on her arrival around midday. We will visit a school together before we fly to Wellington, where I'll host the Prime Minister to dinner at Premier House. On Wednesday, Prime Minister Gillard will be officially welcomed on Parliament's forecourt before meeting ministers and Cabinet at 10 a.m, addressing MPs in the debating chamber at 11 a.m, having a joint press conference at midday and then attending a state luncheon. In the afternoon, we will have a joint wreath-laying ceremony at the National War Memorial. We're excited about the imminent arrival of the Prime Minister. Australia is our closest and warmest relationship, and it's been some time since an Australian Prime Minister has visited New Zealand. While tremendous progress has been made over the years with CER, there's still much work to be done. And while there won't be deliverables in every case, Australia and New Zealand always has many issues to discuss, and I anticipate a busy work programme. I'll be in the House again on Wednesday, then fly to Gisborne to attend the Te Matatini celebrations. On Friday I fly to Hawke's Bay for lunch with attendees of the Tri-Treasury Conference, the opening of the redevelopment of McCain's plant in Hastings and the Art Deco events in Napier. The House this week will consider a range of first readings on the order paper, including 2 regulatory reform bills. Wednesday is a Members' Day, and please note that the second reading of the Marine and Coastal Bill will not be held this week. It will be the following week. There will then be a 1-week recess, and the committee stages will be heard when the House resumes. Questions?
Well, Phil Goff's raised some caution or concern about the investment protocol. Do you have any concerns about the level of threshold for that?
Well, look, we always consider these things carefully. We negotiated with the then former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to increase the threshold for investment coming into New Zealand to, I think it's 475 million from memory. In return for that, New Zealand can invest, I think it's either $1 or $2 billion, but it's a very large number anyway, into Australia without reference to their authorities. And I think that's about right, reflecting the large investment profile of the two countries. Obviously that's a significant advantage for Australian investors vis-a-vis other countries, but I think that reflects the depth of the relationship.
But is there any risk that a lot more of New Zealand businesses will be taken over by Australians?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, just because there's an investment threshold doesn't mean an investment would be turned down. It just simply speeds up the process and gives more surety to investors that they can proceed. If you look at the, I don't have them to hand, but if you look at the number of transactions, the vast bulk are either very, very large or quite small anyway. So there was some concession on our part, but not overly significant.
Do you worry it's a bit one-way traffic when we look at economic integration with Australia? Where 10% of our population lives over there, and it seems like it's one-way traffic to some degree.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, actually, the counter argument was put up, of course, when we signed CER, that their market is 5 times larger than ours, and that they were giving us access to a much larger population, arguably wealthier population. So I don't think it is one-way traffic. I mean, for New Zealand businesses, this means that they face a domestic market of in the order of 24-25 million people. We're now extending that into the capital markets, and I think long term that's very healthy. I think if you look at Australia, the truth of it is that we compete with Australia, but actually Australia and New Zealand compete with the rest of the world. And for a lot of New Zealand companies, Australia is that first stepping stone they take before they branch out into Asia and other parts of the world. So, I think we've got the balance about right.
You were campaigning, though, in the last election about stopping people going to Australia.
Yep.
Phil Goff pointed out today there's 6,000 odd people lining up in the expo to try to get work across the Tasman, so it's hardly worth it.
Well, no, I don't think that's right. You actually have to look at the numbers. So net migration into New Zealand has been strong, plus over 10,000 people. So we're gaining more people than we're losing to the world. Even in terms of those going to Australia, there were smaller numbers in 2009. In 2010, there were about 21,000 people net went to Australia, but that's still less than, say, 2007, 2008, when it was roughly around about 28,000. The fact that people go to an expo, well, that's explained partly by the fact that their unemployment rate is lower than ours. So it's understandable. But, you know, from that point of view, again, if you look at Australia, it's an easy market for people to go to. You don't require a visa. And I think it's worth remembering, I mean, Australia is a country we benchmark ourselves against. Some people have concerns about us doing that. I don't. I think it's the right thing for New Zealand to do. But let's understand, Australia has been the best performing economy in the developed world. So it's, yes, it's doing well, but it's been the best performing economy. So it's natural that some New Zealanders will shift over there. But obviously we're trying to change the economic picture to encourage more New Zealanders to stay. And if you go and look at our tax changes, that's done that.
What would you say to someone who went to that expo and was thinking about going? I mean, is there an argument that they should stay?
Well, first thing I'd say is weigh up all your options. I mean, house prices are significantly more expensive in Australia. Inflation's running at a higher rate in Australia. The top personal rate in Australia cuts in at 45%. New Zealand, it's 33%. So I think you've got to weigh all of those different factors up. There's a lot more costs living in Australia. I lived there in 2001, and it was quite an expensive environment to operate in.
Do you think you've been successful in stemming the tide of people going to Australia? Because it was a key plank in your election campaign.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look in 2009, it was a large reduction. In 2010, we're back to sort of the 20-year averages. And the truth of it is, the only time that net migration between New Zealand and Australia has been positive, in other words, more people coming from Australia to New Zealand than the other way around, is when our wage gap was large and wages were higher in New Zealand than Australia. So if you want to close that tide of people going across the Tasman, you have to lift after-tax wages in New Zealand. And we're doing, I think, quite a good job of that, given the conditions we face. And as I say, remembering that if you look at the terms of trade which are driving a lot of the underlying wage growth in Australia, in New Zealand it's been up about 30% on the back of commodity prices, particularly in the dairy and sheep and meat sector. In Australia it's been 80%. So they have been big beneficiaries of China buying a lot of iron ore.
How much do you think government policy affects the flows, and how much is it just pure economics, that it's a bigger economy that's doing better in the current commodity boom?
Yeah, well, I think the minerals sector plays a big part in driving growth in Australia, and a lot of what I hear from Australian business people, and I see them all the time coming into my office, and I meet them on a regular basis. It's very much a two-speed economy in Australia, between the mining sector and everyone else, and actually between Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne and everywhere else. So there are different factors driving that economy. We over time can change that around. If you look at the reduction we made to the top personal rate in New Zealand, prior to those changes, unless you earned more than $228,000, you paid more tax in New Zealand than Australia. Now it's $55,000. So I think there are some, real advantages in New Zealand, but we've got a long program and it's not going to be instant.
So is the government policy influence at the margins? And the second part of the question, I guess, is does this ever give you pause for thought about opening up the market between New Zealand and Australia, making it easier to go over, making immigration, travel, tourism easier? Because in a way, aren't you just opening the door wider for New Zealanders to leave?
Well, firstly, every New Zealander's got a free option. We all understand that, and they can exercise that if they want to. The vast, overwhelming bulk don't, because they share my ambition for New Zealand to be a much stronger country, a much more successful country, and ultimately to deliver a better future for themselves and their families. But you'll always get some people that leave. If you look in Australia, the debate is about the number of Australians who leave for Asia or America. So it's not an argument that's solely refined to New Zealand. As I said to you, you also have to take into consideration that at the moment they are getting dragged over partly by the job markets in Australia, but Australia is the fastest performing economy in the developed world.
Is there anything that you're discussing with Julia Gillard that's on the table in terms of the common investment protocol, whatever the next steps of economic integration are? Is there anything on the table that's going to close the wage gap with Australia?
for us?
On day one, look, I think you have to look at it as a total package. I mean, ultimately, if you can operate a business on this side of the Tasman, access capital out of Australia and invest it in New Zealand, then you underpin the desire for New Zealand companies to stay here. And I think where we've seen real problems in the past actually has been New Zealand head offices relocating across the Tasman to Australia. That's dragged a lot of quite powerful jobs out of New Zealand across the Tasman. So I don't think changes to mobile phone roaming rates or investment thresholds, things in themselves are the single issue that will stop someone going, but it's a total package, both in terms of what we are doing and what the Australians are doing. But one thing I can tell you is that I think if you look at the package of initiatives we have, there's a lot of Australians who would want to have them. We don't have a significant contribution to pension planning. It's about 2% of someone's in KiwiSaver. In Australia, it's 9%, on its way to, I think, 13 from memory. They face much higher personal rates and company rate in Australia now than they do in New Zealand. So if you go through all of the different factors, I think New Zealand's a good place to operate. We've just got to do better.
How's the wage gap tracking since you've got?
Well, in my view, it's narrowed on an after-tax basis, but I'm prepared to accept that there are various ways that people measure it, but in the series of data that we used in opposition on an after-tax basis, we think we're making gains, and that's because we've been cutting taxes at a faster rate and inflation's been lower in New Zealand.
But that's not sustainable in the long term, is it? I mean, you can't, at some point you can't keep on cutting taxes.
Yeah, but
real wages.
Yeah, but it depends on whether you believe that has a dynamic effect in the economy. I do.
Julia Gillard's address to MPs on Wednesday, was it your preference that that be done during formal sitting hours?
That would have been my first preference, but the Greens made it clear at the Business Committee that they wouldn't support that. And we didn't want to have an embarrassing situation where the Prime Minister of Australia, giving her first formal address in our Parliament and the first foreign leader to do so, had some Member of Parliament get up and object. So it had to be buttoned down before her visit, and on that basis we came to a compromise that she would speak outside of the normal sitting hours.
What's your opinion of the Green Party?
Is it a snub to the Australian Prime Minister that she speaks outside sitting hours rather than during the sitting session?
Well, probably in fairness to the Greens, I can see that they've got a perspective which is to say they may not have a particular issue with Julia Gillard, but they're talking about the long-term precedent here. Personally, I would have preferred it was at 2 o'clock. But look, all said and done, that's a semantic issue. I mean, outside the mace not being on the table, she is going to be the first foreign leader to speak in our Parliament. That's a very significant event, and I think it signifies the importance of the relationship between New Zealand and Australia, and we shouldn't take anything away from that.
I mean, do you envisage any other world leaders being asked to speak to Parliament, either in a formal session or in this way? I mean, have the Greens got anything to be worried about in terms of precedent, or is this pretty much one off anyway?
In my view, no, but look, there's obviously something that we would be very judicious about, careful with. I mean, it's not something we're going to invite every leader, obviously, but clearly if the Prime Minister of Britain or the President of the United States of America or a senior European leader came to New Zealand, we would consider that on a case-by-case basis.
Would you like to speak to the Australian Parliament?
Yes, but that's a matter for their Parliament, and it's not something that we're looking for a reciprocal arrangement about. I don't think, from memory, a New Zealand Prime Minister has spoken in their Parliament, but at some point that might happen. If it does, well, that would be welcome, but I don't see it as a snub if we don't.
Was it just the Greens who objected?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. I mean, one or two other parties had concerns, but I think we could have got them over the line.
Just on the fresh start, the military side.
Oh, yes, yep.
50% of those who completed the course in the last year reoffending. Is it working?
Well, my opinion is, I mean, last time I spoke to Andrew Beecroft, he made it quite clear to me that he was very supportive, actually, of what's happening now. It was in addition to the toolbox, if you like, of initiatives that judges have at their disposal. I think you've got to acknowledge that people that we send through that avenue, because some people go through limited services, volunteer, different program, are really coming from the tough end of town. And these are young people that, if we can keep 50% of them from reoffending, that's a good starting point. Obviously, we'd like to keep 100%, but these are kids that have often badly gone off the rails.
As of November, there wasn't actually an approved framework for monitoring the program or assessing the outcomes.
I think that's because it was in its infancy, but as time goes on and more people go through the courses, we'll have an opportunity to measure all of that.
If 50% reoffending is acceptable, what wouldn't be?
I don't know the answer there. I mean, look, all I can tell you is that we are looking to try and turn these young people's lives around. when we know that when someone's in prison, that just the physical cost of that is the better part of $100,000 a year, and then there's the impact it has on the communities and others that they affect as they cause crime. So in my view, it's a worthwhile tool. I think we would all accept that if we could tackle the drivers of crime and stop people committing crime in the first place, and these youngsters having to appear before the youth court, then that would be a big step forward. But there's a lot of work to be done there.
How long would you expect it to take to get an answer as to whether it's actually making a difference or not?
Well, we'll continue to monitor it. We've got nothing to hide by it. I'm personally very supportive of the programs, and I think they've worked well. I think they've also worked well for limited services volunteers, which is those that actually volunteer to go through, often people that have been unemployed for a period of time. All I can tell you is my personal experiences of it, and they've been very positive in terms of the feedback I've had from people who have gone on the course. But these are youngsters who in the case of where they come through the youth court, often have very substantial issues. They often are disconnected from their families. They may be living on the streets. They may often have a drug or alcohol problem. They've committed significant crime to be there, and nothing has worked up until that point. So these are not the easiest cases to deal with.
Does the government have a target, recidivism target for people who go through camps?
I'm not sure we've set a target actually, but look, over time we'll continue to monitor it.
But, I mean, in monitoring it, there is presumably a point where you'd be able to say it's not working where it is statistically in terms of...
Well, I guess it was at 50% we'd say it's working. I mean, in so much that if you go and do the mathematical calculation of what it costs to have someone on the course vis-a-vis what it costs to have someone in prison, and I mean, it depends on the wider cost of someone going to jail and why they go there, then I think you'd argue that's a good step.
Well, it's a question of whether it affects their risk going on.
Well, I don't think that's no. Okay, thanks, Roger.